we're firing away. Morning, gang. So this week's we're going to talk about the upper extremities and the arm and the top of the rib cage and the thoracic inlet. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah.
Is that what's on the case study? So you're going to guide me as to what we need on the case study and what we're going to do. So when I look at the shoulder, I don't know how big this appears. But what I've got here is the shoulder muscles back and front with the scapula and the humeral head and a little bit of the collarbone. You've got a lot of muscles tying into a shoulder because it has to do quite a big range of movement. And I still see it as a gear train. Now, when we talked about gear trains before with the spine, I don't know how much of an understanding we got of a gear train. But in the body, gear trains are initiated by the first movement, and the first movement requires the biggest effort. Once you've got a gear train moving, as you can see with this in the diagram, then as I turn this clockwise, the next wheel goes anti-clockwise and the next wheel goes clockwise. So when you look at the foot, you could look at the heterokinetic junction of the tibia meeting the talus, that when the foot touches the floor, it starts a rotation of the tibia, which is the start of a gear train. That rotates up through the femur, that starts to rotate the iliac bone, the opposite iliac bone rotates the opposite way, the sacrum's going the opposite way to that. So you can see that you've got a vertical gear train in place. So as soon as the foot touches the floor, doesn't matter which part of the foot, it sends different signals back up to the center of axis of the body. And that starts the iliac bone motion going, and that starts to compress the lumbar spine, and we're ready for propulsion and moving off. So when we look at the arm, that's also a gear train. If you see it as a gear train, then it gives me a clear idea of what I'm working with. So there's no such thing as a wrist problem or an elbow problem or a shoulder problem. This part of the gear train isn't working properly. When I came across Stephen Levin about 25 years ago, he describes anatomy in a totally different way to the norm, which is levers, Newtonian weight bearing. And when you look at the shoulder, this is a ligamented shoulder here. What you've got here is the humeral head is actually bigger than the glenoid cavity. Whereas in the hip, you've got your hip socket and your acetabulum and your head of your femur. That's a much more of a ball and socket joint. When you look at this as being a ball and socket joint, the humerus is vertically aligned with the glenoid cavity. So straight away you'd have vertical shear on there. And any load applied to the arm at 90 degrees would also produce a direct downward shear on here. And when you think of the ligaments in the elbow connecting the bones together with the arm extended, again, that's going to be subject to vertical shears. And also when you come to the wrist and it's holding something out here, then that's also subject to vertical shears. And so a big part of Stephen Levin's biotensegrity argument is that the body cannot be Newtonially connected with ligaments to withstand those kind of vertical shears and gravity and weight as well. So it's got to be that it's more tensegrous and part of a gear train, so that the crisscross effect of the ligaments on the wrist and the arrangement of the elbow here to allow the radius and the ulna to go through its movements and then come up to the shoulder and produce its gear wheel is one intricate set of stabilizers. Thanks. And what you've got with this model here is that strut fibers, which make up an icosahedron. So we've got an icosahedron there, an open frame one. So the cables are the soft tissues and the wood is the struts basically. And there's no place better to put the icosahedron than in the shoulder, because the ligamentous arrangement that holds those three bones together to not form a true joint, and the scapula is considered to be a sesamoid bone, the same as the patella, suspended in space. So it isn't really a true articulation at all. It's something that floats in space. Its center of, I'm going to write on this, I think I can, it's my model. Its center of axis is about there on the scapula. And so from that place, the scapula is in suspension. It revolves around that axis of motion with the various muscles, front, back, top, left side. So it's totally surrounded by muscles and works to freely give strength to the arm and power to the arm as we want to lift and move and work. And so one of the ways that I had it described to me, where's my pens? Is that if we look at the scapula and we look at we've got the groove for the supraspinatus there. You've got the glenoid cavity here, which is a very shallow joint, and you've got your humerus coming down here. And there's the centre of axis. Is that coming in the picture?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
That's good. There's the centre of axis there. If you look at it as a weight-bearing joint, as we described earlier, with this at 90 degrees, the amount of shear forces down here would be incredible. It just wouldn't be able to withstand anything. So it's got to be able to transfer the loads differently. So when you look at how things can actually transfer loads, then you can start to understand the tensegrity of that load shift. So if we had a cartwheel with the hub in the middle, an old cartwheel with wooden spokes, then what you've got is some distribution of weight coming from the floor up through, and it comes up through one of these spokes and goes to the hub. And what happened in the old days is they didn't have much shock absorbency. This was taking all of the weight bearing and the gravity from the top, and the spokes would quite often break. So that wasn't a really tensegrous unit. Now when you look at a bike wheel, we look at the same wheel and now make it a steel bike wheel with lots of spokes. The difference with that structure is that any weight bearing coming down and any weight bearing coming up is transferred not through one spoke to the central hub, but to the whole rim and all of the spokes. And that's how tensegrity works. So then it makes much more sense to distribute weight as the joint is moving through those ranges of motion. So I see it more as a spoke wheel suspension bone with the centre of axis revolving around that. Then we've got all the muscles of the shoulder. So I don't know again how clear this is, but we've got different models. I can show you as we get closed in.
I can hold that up if you want.
Yeah. So if you're going to point at the different muscles, son.
Yeah.
So looking at these, some of the muscles are dissected through, but you've got.
Go forward down.
So we're looking at the back. So we've got the teres major at the bottom.
Yeah.
Very bottom there, which attaches to the humerus and the bottom of the scapula. You've got the infraspinatus. No, the infraspinatus is on. Yeah, the infraspinatus should show on that.
Yeah.
And we've got the teres minor.
Yeah.
So they're all pretty much horizontally placed muscles. Now, horizontally placed muscles appear in a few places in the body, in the pelvis and across the shoulders, and they facilitate cross-pattern moving. So if I'm doing this with my elbow, then I'm using my teres minor and teres major and other muscles to stabilize. And the same if I'm doing the same with my legs and crossing them over, I'm using the piriformis, and they're your cross-pattern movements. And as we rehabilitate, it's very important that these muscles are free, because cross-motor patterning is a big part of brain integration, and brain integration means better spatial awareness, better proprioception, better motor control and everything. So it's important that those muscles are free of restriction. So when we're testing those, we're looking for fibrosity, dehydration, tightness in those muscles, and then using the various methods to free them off. As we look at the ligaments and look at the whole tensegrity. So this model here, what it represents is basically how the strut fibers in any part of the structure would work, but especially the spine. And so it doesn't work very well anymore. It's an old model.
But it just shows that it's not joined on anymore.
Yeah, but it's not joined on. So if you look at this as being the shoulder coming into the body, then as it joins the body, it distributes its weight and weight bearing. So here's your wheel, there's your shoulder blade. You can do that in a different colour, do it in red. With its centre of axis right here, and the muscles around it representing the wheel. Then to transfer loads from the shoulder into the body, what it does is it transfers loads around that rim, which is basically the thorax and the soft tissues. So things like the anterior serratus, the ribcage, the sternum, the spine, all accept part of that load. So we become a tension coupled unit. So if I had something heavy, here's my scapula here, there's my arm. If I had something here that I was wanting to do mechanically hard, then I'm not using my wrist, I'm not using my elbow, I'm not using the backstop of my shoulder. If I'm working a long arc, I'm working with the whole span of dynamics. And also anything that's coming the other way, any force coming into the body, is being distributed to the soft tissues of the thorax itself. So we basically, the shoulder, even though it isn't what's called a true joint, it's got 5 articulations, but none of the true articulations. It's in suspension, and the muscles are very important. Now, when you look at muscles being important, obviously we look at the tent pole again. So if you've got one muscle pulling harder than the other, then the position of the scapula is not going to be at rest. And the way that the scapula sits on the thorax is called the scapulothoracic joint. And basically, it's the connection between the shoulder blade. Is that coming in okay? Mm-hmm. The shoulder blade, again with its centre of axis, just put its centre of axis on there, which is right there, revolving around. Now, its range of motion is, the first movement we get is the supraspinatus, basically, and that's called glenohumeral movement. So the first 20 degrees of abduction is the supraspinatus.